Good evening. Did you know that food can just as easily spread disease as pests and rodents? Several outbreaks throughout history have been traced back to food. In fact, in America, over 3,037 people a year die from foodborne illnesses. This chart shows the foods most commonly associated with cross contamination, the main source of foodborne illnesses. These foods, such as raw poultry, raw meat, fish, eggs, and dairy, should not mix in their raw forms or mix between cooked and raw. This mixing causes cross contamination, which can happen to anyone in as long as they're preparing food. This affects not just restaurant food that you go out and eat, but also food you prepare at home as well. As a professional fry cook for Double Cook, I learned all about cross contamination during my food preparation training, in which we studied cross contamination and how to avoid it. It's important to me that you avoid cross contamination to protect yourself, your friends, and your family, and anyone else who may eat your cooking, or anyone whose cooking you may eat, from illness. Today we will discuss cross contamination, what it is, what it does, and how to avoid it. But before you can address cross contamination, you must first know what it is. According to the CDC guidelines, cross contamination is the transfer of harmful bacteria from raw food to cooked food, from raw food to a surface, and from raw food to oneself, which is then transferred from either cooked food or to another raw food. Cross contamination most commonly occurs, well, of course, in the kitchen. And most of that occurs when raw food touches cooked food. There are several different types of cross contamination. But those different types of cross contamination can occur in a variety of places, such as when shopping, when refrigerating food, when preparing food, or when serving food. And those types of cross contamination that can occur in any of those instances are food to food cross contamination, which usually occurs when raw food touches cooked food, or when one type of raw food, such as raw poultry, touches another type of raw food, such as raw vegetables, and the bacteria are transferred over. There's also person to food cross contamination, when you touch raw food with your hands and then touch something else, like a food preparation device, like a cutting board or a knife, and then you touch that with a third raw food, and the bacteria transfers on from you to your food. And there is also person to equipment to food cross contamination, when the equipment with the cross contaminated bacteria touches another food, spreading that bacteria onward. Cross contamination is prevalent in all these forms, and not just in the home, but in restaurants as well. The prevalence of cross contamination in restaurants is why they have so many food preparation guidelines. This chart is an example of a restaurant's food preparation guidelines. In this chart, you see that they show the specific order of stacking foods in their refrigerator. Already prepped foods such as sandwiches. Then you have your cooked meats, your raw meats, like your roast beef, your raw steak, your round ground beef, and then your raw poultry. And while several of those foods, while raw, come from the same animal, they are stacked differently and placed differently to avoid cross contamination. Cross contamination does not stop at restaurants or the kitchen, though. It can also occur in groceries, or, well, the grocery store. Cross contamination in the grocery store usually occurs when raw meat touches other foods in your cart. To avoid this, you should usually put your raw food in a sack of some sort to avoid the juices spilling and cross contamination occurring. But now that we know what cross contamination is, we need to know how to avoid it. And we also, but more importantly, we need to know why we avoid it. And to do that, we must know what effects cross contamination has. According to Healthline.com, cross contamination has many effects, both major and minor. The minor effects being such simple things as loss of appetite, upset stomach, dizziness, or nausea. But the major effects are more dire, things such as dehydration, organ failure, and even death. The best way to prevent yourself from feeling these effects is to prevent yourself from cross-contaminating. And that's why we need to know how to avoid cross-contamination. Now, how you avoid cross-contamination is dependent on what situation you are and what type of food you're in and what type of food you're working with. This shows different areas and things with which you work with food, like the grocery store, represented by the shopping cart, the cutting board, which represents the kitchen, and the refrigerator, which represents refrigerating and storing food. First of all, when shopping, you should always separate your foods. As I said earlier, you're going to separate your raw meat, poultry, and seafood from other things like your vegetables and your fruits. And by once again placing these foods in plastic bags to prevent juices from dripping and cross-contamination from occurring in the cart. But there are also things to look out for when refrigerating food. This can be much of the same, placing raw meat and poultry in containers or plastic bags to prevent juice from dripping. Those juices often contain harmful bacteria that you do not want interacting with your other foods. There are also, but this does not just apply for meat. As we said earlier, eggs are also something you need to watch out for with cross-contamination. You need to wash hands and surfaces often. Wash your hands with soap and hot water and before touching eggs, and you need to keep them in their original carton. You must also use, but this doesn't just stop at refrigeration. You must also, we talked about person to equipment cross-contamination earlier, such as with cutting boards. This is an example of what not to do. You see that raw meat and those vegetables mixing together, you don't want that. That's a showcase of cross-contamination. Now with cutting boards, you need to make sure that you use everything separate, a separate cutting board for each different type of food. And if you are to use the same cutting board for another food, you must sure to thoroughly wash it with soap and hot water before using it for another type of food. Now, cross-contamination is not just for meat. It also occurs with fruits and vegetables. One way to avoid cross-contamination with them is to rinse them off in tap water, remove dirt and grime, and then discard the leaves of such things like lettuce or cabbage, because that's where you will find the outward bacteria. And then finally, we talk about when serving food. This is rather simple things you should be doing anyway, such as always using clean plates and never placing cooked food back on a surface that held raw food. Now, To summarize, cross-contamination is, as we said earlier, the transfer of harmful bacteria from one food to another, or from one food to another surface. It is the source of many foodborne illnesses and can be avoided with proper handling and care. Cross-contamination is dangerous. It can have ill effects. Those range from the mild to the serious. But if we handle our food properly and with care, cross-contamination can easily be avoided. It's hard, but it's worth it for the health of you and others.